Good evening, everyone. Can you all in the back hear okay? If not, it's good that you said yes, because otherwise I'd ask you to move forward. I'm Randy Wyckoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health. It's my very real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Leading Voices in Public Health lecture series. This series goes back to 2007, but about 8 years ago we started the Justice, Health, and Humanities lecture. And it started, interestingly, when Mike Allen's student organization and mine got together and brought us together to talk about some issues around social justice. And I realized then that there's this overlap between philosophy and public health. And after co-teaching the class a couple of times, we realized that that overlap was even broader. So this will be the 6th time we've brought in a speaker to really talk to us about the interface of, if you will, broadly philosophy and public health. We've had people talk about global food shortages, rights to health care, humanitarian response. I mean, and really, you come to realize how important a philosophical mindset is for all of us, whatever we're doing. And our speaker this evening really exemplifies that. Dr. David Harker is the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Humanities, and is also the author of a book, whose name I cannot remember, Creating Scientific Controversy, Uncertainty and Bias in Science and Sociology. David's PhD is from the University of Illinois, Chicago in philosophy. He has a master's and undergraduate degrees from the University of Sheffield, including a bachelor's degree in pure mathematics. And I had to look that up. And I wondered what the opposite was. But on his home page, he has something written that I think says a lot. It says, in his most recent research, he focused on problems surrounding misinformation and how we can better protect ourselves and others from its worst consequences. He says he's increasingly sympathetic to the idea that we have a moral responsibility to believe only what evidence can support. And I think in this time, I don't have to tell anyone in this room how widespread, pervasive, and potentially dangerous misinformation is. So I'm really excited to introduce Dr. David Harker.
Okay. How close to this microphone is anyone? Should I take it out?
You can.
All right. Passed the first test. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wyckoff, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the College of Public Health for co-sponsoring this talk, along with my own Department of Philosophy and Humanities. Thanks to everybody from the college who's helped to organize the event and promote it and advertise it, in particular to Jen Stork, who I know has put in a lot of work. It seems to me that when you're organizing and promoting an event on misinformation, then that brings with it an extra responsibility to make sure that you're accurate in all the information that you share. So I'm very glad that everybody was able to live up to that extra pressure. I have been thinking about misinformation for quite a long time, and one thing that I've learned in the process is that the only way to be sure that you're not yourself guilty of spreading misinformation is to share no information at all. So never write anything down, never utter anything. But it also occurs to me that it would not really be in the spirit of a public talk if I was just to end my remarks here. So I will press on and risk confusing you all, but hopefully that won't happen. So the plan is just to talk a little bit about the concept of misinformation, how we might think about it, and then to turn to the main question, which is what are we to do about misinformation? And for both of those questions, I'm going to follow a rule of 3, where I'm going to introduce 2 answers that are in some sense inadequate or deficient, And then I'll try and offer a third answer, which I think is, in some sense, illuminating or important or an improvement. All right. So what even is misinformation? Well, you might think that an essential feature of misinformation is that it is in some sense implausible, or that it's not well supported by available evidence. Maybe you think that misinformation is counter or contrary to what would be accepted within mainstream scientific communities. But I think there are good reasons not to define misinformation in terms of plausibility. So if we think about these ideas, anecdotal evidence or evidence that gets cherry-picked or examples that get cherry-picked, if we think about the way in which information can get framed by certain networks or groups or media outlets, if we think about the way certain narratives can get created, then a lot of what happens here is actually very reliable, sensible information gets shared. It's just that it's shared in ways that encourage people to draw inferences that we don't want them to draw. So the main point here is a lot of information might actually function as a kind of misinformation, even though there's nothing inherently implausible about it. So just to give one quick example, if your neighbor's grandfather did smoke a pack of cigarettes every day for their entire life and never suffered a day's ill health, then the problem with that is not that it's false or implausible. The problem is that people might be tempted to draw something more general about the risks of smoking cigarettes. So plausibility doesn't seem the best standard by which to define or think about misinformation. You might alternatively think that misinformation is centrally about deceit and dishonesty, that it's inherently about lying to people. But again, I think that's going to miss the mark in some important ways. A lot of information gets shared by people or is promoted and developed by people because they have a very well-intentioned concern. So they are, if you like, true believers. They genuinely ascribe to what they're talking about, and they're sharing this with others because they think other people need to know. This isn't a matter of trying to deceive people. It's not a matter of trying to lie to people. And of course, a lot of what happens with misinformation is that it's the result of people just casually sharing it through social media. So again, there's no direct or explicit intent to try and deceive. This guy pictured up here is an American philosopher called Harry Frankfurt, and about 20 years ago he published a book which has got a lot of attention, and it was called On Bullshit. And in this, Frankfurt tries to provide an analysis of what bullshit is. And one thing that he tries to emphasize is that the person who's bullshitting isn't always trying to lie. They're not trying to deceive you. Often they're just trying to influence your behavior via whatever means that come to hand. So sometimes this might be saying things that are true. Sometimes it might be saying things that are implausible, but the bullshitter isn't really concerned with the truth value. They're not really concerned with whether a statement or an utterance is true or plausible or false. They're just concerned with trying to achieve their own goals, which will typically involve manipulating public behavior. And more modern scholars, or more recent scholars on misinformation have noted that one thing that can happen with misinformation is that the public can get distracted or disoriented by the amount of information that's out there. And so again, this pulls us away from the idea that, that misinformation is about deceit. If you flood the marketplace of ideas with enough stuff, if there's just enough out there, then everybody gets overwhelmed, and now we can't possibly start evaluating it all carefully. We get distracted, we get disoriented, and as a result we might cling on to certain core beliefs, and that might be really useful to those who are trying to manipulate our behavior. But again, it's not really about deceit in these cases. It's just about using whatever ideas or intuitions or assumptions come to hand. So, oh, and one more thing I was going to add here. Within this literature, there is now quite a well-known distinction that gets used between disinformation and misinformation, where the former, disinformation, does involve a deliberate intent to try and deceive, whereas misinformation does not include that. So the way in which I think about misinformation, I think this is the best way to think about it, is that it's misleading. And it's misleading when it comes to people making decisions. So I think what's most important about misinformation, what's most troubling about misinformation, is that it increases the chances that individuals will make poorer decisions relative to their goals. Just back to the plausibility, another kind of counterexample I could have mentioned are common misconceptions. So it turns out that there's no real evidence, for example, that the helmets of Vikings had horns. And it turns out, maybe you're all aware of this, but bulls are colorblind, so it doesn't matter what color the rag is that the matador has. A red rag is no more offensive to a bull than any other color rag. So these are misconceptions. They're false beliefs that people have, but they don't seem to fit our notions about misinformation. I don't think people regard those kinds of mistakes as examples of misinformation. And this gives us a plausible explanation as to why. What really troubles us about misinformation is its potential to mislead people in ways that result in them making poorer decisions. All right, so that's the first question. The second question is going to take longer. All right, so what are we supposed to do about misinformation? Here's a first, I think, very natural, intuitive sort of response. If the problem is that people are basing their decisions on misleading information, then what you want to do is replace that with reliable information, with something that's more relevant given the choices that they confront. Give them more, give them better information. But of course, from personal experience, we all know that you can give people information in the most articulate way you can summon, and it can be the most cogent, compelling evidence that there is possible, and people will still resist what you're presenting them with. So we know from personal experience that giving people more reliable, more relevant information isn't always effective. And we see this, of course, on much larger scales. We're aware that misconceptions can take a very, very long time to be corrected within the public sphere. Despite concerted efforts by journalists and documentary makers and others to try and inform the public, those efforts can often take a very, very long time to work. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying to correct people's misconceptions and to try and give them more reliable, relevant information. It's always important to try, but I think insofar as this strategy looks inadequate, looks like it's not going to do the job on its own, then we might want to look to alternatives. There's also the question as to why people aren't more responsive to evidence. Why don't people respond to evidence in the ways that we think they ought to? That's a really big, complicated question. There are lots of ways of trying to think about that. I'm just going to mention a couple, which perhaps will be of interest to you. So there's a psychologist, a Yale psychologist called Dan Kahan, who does lots of really interesting work in this area. And he talks a lot about cultural cognition, and he talks about the ways in which our political and social views, worldviews, ideas have a very big influence on the way in which we process information, the ways in which we reason. One of the ways that he explores this is by looking at who accepts mainstream scientific ideas, who rejects mainstream scientific ideas, and importantly, how well they understand the relevant science. And what's really interesting is those who reject the idea of anthropogenic human-caused climate change, for example, versus those that accept anthropogenic climate change, understand the main concepts and the main arguments and the main evidence pretty much equally well. It's not the case that the people who are aligned with mainstream science have a much better grasp of the relevant science. Everybody seems to, on average, people understand the science sort of similarly well, but they still end up with diametrically opposed views about the main sort of core conclusions. So that's really interesting. Another way in which Kahan has explored this is by doing more controlled studies where he presents participants with some fictional data. So one of his examples, he gave participants data on fictional data on the relationship between stricter gun laws and then the subsequent effect on crime rates within some city. Half the participants were given a data set which, if properly interpreted, suggested that stricter gun laws would lead to a decrease in crime rates. The other half, the other participants, were given evidence which, if correctly interpreted, would lead to the opposite conclusion. What he also had participants do was fill out questionnaires which gave him a means of identifying their cultural or social political beliefs. And what he discovered through this process, this method, was that people were far more likely to make mistakes when interpreting the data if those mistakes led to conclusions that they were predisposed to prefer. So someone who was at a far more conservative outlook was far more likely to misinterpret the evidence if that mistake, if the error in their reasoning led them to conclude that this data set supports the idea that stricter gun laws will lead to an increase in crime. And those with more liberal political and social views, it was exactly the opposite. They were more likely to misinterpret the evidence if it suggested a conclusion that was friendly to their worldview. Now, Kahan emphasizes that we shouldn't regard this as something inherently irrational. And Kahan points to the importance of social identity. We are social creatures. We understand ourselves a lot by trying to understand the social groups that we belong to. There are good reasons why we wouldn't want to upset or offend or hold beliefs that are contrary to what seem prevalent within our social groups. We benefit from being parts of social groups. We benefit in terms of psychological well-being, material gains. So Kahan points to these very practical reasons why our social identity is important to us and uses that as a way of arguing that what's happening here shouldn't be dismissed as just straightforwardly irrational. But there's a philosopher who writes on similar issues who thinks that these kinds of habits are rational in an even stronger sense. And we might think of this as a sort of belief outsourcing. So how do we form beliefs? How do we come up with our beliefs about public health, about medicine, about climate change, about anything else whatsoever? We like to think that our beliefs are just the result of our own efforts to evaluate the evidence as carefully as we can. The philosopher Neil Levy, who talks a lot about belief outsourcing, says that that's not really the right way of understanding the mechanisms by which we form beliefs at all. According to Levy, what we're doing really when we're forming beliefs is we're looking out into the wider community and trying to figure out what does everybody else seem to believe, and then we adopt that for ourselves. And furthermore, Levy thinks that isn't such a bad strategy for forming beliefs. So he marshals quite a lot of evidence in support of this idea. But at least one way of thinking about it is, so think back to our ancestors millions or, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they're venturing into new ecosystems with new challenges different predators that they have to figure out how to tackle, different food sources, different meteorological challenges maybe. So a very different ecosystem with lots and lots of novel kinds of problems. So the individual might decide the best way for me to thrive is just to figure all this out for myself. I need to figure out how to avoid these predators. I need to figure out what's safe to eat, how I can prepare these things in order to make them safe to eat, how to protect myself against this or that threat or challenge. But for Levy, that idea that the individual can solve all these problems for themselves is just unrealistic. The far more plausible survival strategy is to look out into others within the community and ask, what are they doing that seems to be working, and then just copy that. We become mimics of those around us who seem to be doing reasonably well. So if we have that kind of tendency, that habit, just to pick up from our community what we ought to be doing, what we ought to be thinking, then we're going to end up with these sort of views that look like they're associated with social identities. Okay, so it's going to be difficult to overcome misinformation just by providing with people with more reliable information, with more information, because we have these kinds of habits and tendencies. Now, these might lead you to think that maybe the solution to misinformation is less about giving people more information, overwhelming them with more data and more evidence. Maybe the solution to misinformation is just to improve everybody's critical thinking skills. And it's certainly a very popular refrain that we could all analyze arguments more objectively, we could evaluate the credibility of different sources, we could insist on more evidence when claims are made that seem suspicious. So critical thinking skills are certainly highly valued, and people are very keen to try and improve critical thinking within our students and our community more generally. And I certainly don't want to discourage anyone from trying to improve their or others' critical thinking. Absolutely, I think critical thinking is key. But in the same way that on the previous slide I suggested that giving people more information might not be as effective as we would hope, I think there are similar reasons to think that critical thinking on its own might be insufficient. Or it might be insufficient even paired with giving them more information. So first of all, and this is maybe just going to rehash a point I've already made, it's a very heavy lift to try and expect everybody to be carefully evaluating every claim, every argument, every issue that crosses their plate. We're just overwhelmed with information, and trying to evaluate it all critically and carefully is beyond any single person. I'll just mention a couple of other things quickly. One is that we don't have very good methods for detecting bias within our own reasoning. So there's a temptation maybe, if you're reflecting on some argument or reflecting on some line of reasoning, to try and think, am I being biased here? Am I being rational? And to sort of try and turn inward and evaluate whether bias is contaminating the reasoning process. Well, our bias detection tools are just not up to the task. We just can't look inside ourselves and then identify where bias is playing a role and where it isn't. So that's a problem. And then let me also just quickly point out that critical thinking is very often supposed to involve evaluating both sides. In order to be a good critical thinker, you're supposed to evaluate both sides of the debate or both sides of the issue. But very often we might not even be aware that there are two sides, and we only learn that there are two sides to a debate by immersing ourselves in it. And the more we read, the more distinctions we become aware of, the more objections we become aware of, the more refinements to ideas we become aware of. So if the hope was that critical thinking was this small set of highly general abstract principles that we could just apply to particular cases, then I think that's an illusion. The way we become better critical thinkers on lots and lots of issues is by reading a lot more, by understanding it a lot better, by familiarizing ourselves with a lot more evidence. But now we're just back to the same problem that there's only so much each of us can do. So reasons here, I think, to suspect that there are limits to what we'll achieve by encouraging better critical thinking. Even though, and I really do want to, I'm terrified by the thought that the headlines are going to be philosophy professor suggests that critical thinking is not important. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that. Just saying, got to be realistic about what it can achieve. And there is also a sense in which what I'm going to move on to could be considered part of critical thinking. Critical thinking doesn't have particularly well-defined boundaries. So depending how you define critical thinking, perhaps I'm just gesturing or pointing towards an aspect of it that I think gets neglected. All right, so what I think is problematic about both the approaches or responses I've offered so far is that they assume this really strong, impossible kind of epistemic individualism. Please, it took me ages to do this picture, so please enjoy the picture just for a minute. But the idea with epistemic individualism, as I'm using the term here, is that if we could just fill someone's head with enough knowledge, with enough data, with enough ideas, equip it with enough tools, then the individual will be protected against misinformation. And so we just need to do this over and over and over again. We just need to do this for every member of the population, and then misinformation will evaporate. But it doesn't seem sensible when we think about the amount of knowledge and understanding, the expertise that's distributed across entire communities, then clearly what an individual can achieve is just going to pale in comparison to that much larger group. And this much larger group, might include experts with very specific kinds of training and knowledge and understanding. It might be a community of scientists which is very committed to trying to uncover any of the errors in their existing work. There might be a really strong commitment within this group to try and identify what's most plausible given available evidence. So what a group can achieve is always going to be far more significant than what an individual can achieve. And so somehow I think responding to misinformation well has to involve tapping into this kind of collective wisdom, tapping into the knowledge that's somehow distributed across huge groups of people. So how do we do that? Well, I think a good place to start is with the notion of self-awareness. So self-awareness might be awareness that we all have our own biases, and it might include awareness that we're not very, we don't have very direct access to the ways in which we're biased. We can't identify them just through introspection. Self-awareness might include recognition that our upbringing has a big influence on how we come to think about things, who we trust, why we trust them, what we've been exposed to. Personal experiences can play an important role in how we respond to evidence. People who have had particularly bad experiences are going to respond to news in different ways. People have their motives, their desires, their ambitions. We should be self-aware about our relative expertise. So we should recognize that often there are others in the community who are far better positioned to reach sensible judgments and decisions or sensible conclusions about the issues that we care about. Just a quick aside, when I talk about expertise here, I don't mean to be talking just about those who have a lot of training and qualifications. expertise can be found everywhere. So an example that I like to give is that the doctor is the expert when it comes to health and medicine, but the patient is the expert on questions about how much this is interfering with their lives and how painful it is and so on. So we're all experts on a whole host of issues. So we shouldn't confuse expertise with the possession of certain qualifications or training. Those can certainly be important, but it's not the whole story. So if we could promote self-awareness as a virtue, an intellectual virtue, then I think that would be a really helpful thing. We want people to be more aware as to who's well positioned to understand issues, who's better positioned than they are, how might biases be affecting them, and so on. Okay. So what else can we say about self-awareness? Well, there's a concept within philosophy that's been getting a lot of attention in the last 20 years or so, which I really like, and it's the concept of higher order evidence. And let me try and define for you what higher order evidence is, and then explain why I think it's important. So, I'll slow down a little bit here. So higher order evidence is evidence concerning an individual's ability to evaluate evidence. A sports fan, let's think about sports fans. They're watching a game and the referee, there's the referee, Michael, the referee makes a call and people aren't quite sure whether it was the right call or not. Now here we might be aware that our own biases could be affecting our judgment. So there's part of us wanting to scream at the television and say, the referee made the wrong call. But self-awareness is going to involve recognizing that we have evidence that we're not impartial observers of this. So we can have evidence about our ability to evaluate the evidence. It seems to me that the referee made the wrong call, but I have evidence that I'm probably not the right person to ask. And I think this crops up over and over again. Think about parents evaluating their children. We know that parents have, and appropriately, rose-tinted glasses to some extent when they're observing their children. That's not a bad thing, but in certain cases we hope that parents are self-aware enough to recognize that, maybe I'm not the most objective evaluator of their behavior or what's happening. So higher order evidence, I think, is a really interesting concept, and it can be helpful when thinking about self-awareness. The dominant philosophical puzzle within this literature has always been, how do you assimilate these kinds of evidence? How do you assimilate first-order evidence and higher-order evidence? So I have my first-order evidence, the call that was made on the field and my observation as to where the players were and so on. I have my higher-order evidence about my lack of I'm not impartial when it comes to the call that's being made on the field. So how do I somehow combine those pieces of evidence to form a rational judgment? That's the puzzle that's dominated the philosophical literature. But I'm inclined to regard these as illustrations of just our own inability to I don't think there's a solution. I don't think we can reconcile the first order and the higher order evidence. I think what these puzzles illustrate is that we all, on a very regular basis, are confronted with what we might think of as lens problems. So we can see things through our own lens, and we can know that if things were viewed through a different lens, then we would come away with a more objective kind of view, a more reasonable, sensible view. But those other lenses just aren't available to us. We can only see things and understand things as they're presented to us. And so there's a very significant sort of limit on how much we can achieve. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, I want to suggest a very different kind of approach at this stage. So the man pictured here is a 19th century philosopher called William Clifford. And Clifford, in a paper called The Ethics of Belief, talks about how our beliefs inform our actions. So we have beliefs about the world, we have beliefs about who's trustworthy and who isn't, we have beliefs about how things work, what kinds of interventions are likely to be successful, and so on and so forth. Our beliefs inform our actions. And our actions will themselves produce benefits and harms to varying degrees for different individuals who are affected. Also, importantly for Clifford, our beliefs are going to influence what other people come to believe. This goes back really to that Levy point about how we look to our community to try and figure out what it's reasonable to believe. So, insofar as we carelessly share information, and then other people act on that information, according to Clifford, we have to share some of the responsibility. So when we carelessly share things on social media, and people act on that information that we've shared, and suffer some harm as a result, then according to Clifford, we're partially responsible for the harms that they have felt. Now, Clifford is very clearly very much part of the individualist approach to epistemology, to thinking about knowledge and beliefs and the methods by which we evaluate evidence. Clifford is not thinking about knowledge and ideas as being distributed across wider communities. But we can think about our responsibility as being part of a social community. We can think of the role that we play within a community where knowledge is spread very widely and also very, very unevenly, where some people might have a great deal of insight into some issue and other people might have considerably less. What are our responsibilities within those groups? And I think one key responsibility is that we ought to get out of the way of those who know better. So this is one of the big mistakes that people make, is that they encourage us to act on their advice rather than on the advice of those who are actually well positioned to give meaningful, helpful advice. So if we could promote this principle, if we could promote this advice that it's important to get out of the way of those who know better, then that might actually do some good. Simultaneously, I think what the idea of knowledge being distributed across a community suggests is that we have a responsibility to try and engage those who we have evidence to suggest know less about an issue. It can be really uncomfortable to try and challenge people on things. And I'm certainly not suggesting that it's everybody's responsibility to try and correct every misconception out there. But I think if we constantly turn away from the opportunities to try and correct others, then there's a sense in which we can be accused of not fulfilling an important social responsibility. A story circulated a few years ago about a young man called Derek Black. And Derek Black was the godson of a Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard. And Black was regarded as a future leader for the white nationalist movement. He designed and built a website for children that promoted white nationalism. He did a radio show. He did a podcast. He was a rising star in the white nationalist circles. He went off to college and befriended people who did not originally know his views, these racist, abhorrent views. But they figured out who he was, and they were able to identify him from things that were happening online. But rather than sort of run away, they started engaging him in conversation. And over a fairly long, drawn-out process, Derek Black eventually turned away from white nationalism and came to recognize it as a very evil, dangerous worldview. So I think this is an illustration that if we engage people in conversation and try to live up to this responsibility of occasionally, sometimes being brave and talking to people who we think are badly mistaken on important issues, then we can make an important difference. Okay, so summarizing. The real problem with misinformation is that it undermines good decision making. It can affect whether someone gets vaccinated or not. It affects who people vote for, what they value, who they trust. Misinformation can do enormous amounts of damage in these kinds of ways. Gathering more information, providing people with more information is absolutely important. And so is encouraging people to reason better. If we can promote better critical thinking, if we can encourage people to be more disposed towards better critical thinking, that's important. But both of these approaches, if we're not careful, can assume a sort of troubling individualism, where we think that every individual needs to be fully informed and fully equipped with all the skills that we know are actually widely distributed across a community. So somehow what we have to grapple with, somehow what we have to contend with is that our own limited perspective is always going to pale in comparison to this collective view. And we have to figure out how to behave responsibly when the relevant information is distributed so widely. I think self-awareness here is a really important concept, an important intellectual virtue. So we ought to try and cultivate self-awareness in ourselves, and we ought to learn to admire those who seem themselves to be self-aware. Those who are not self-aware think that they've got all the answers. But those that are not self-aware think that they can create their own reality, and that becomes reality. So those are the kinds of attitudes that we need to recognize as being the opposite of virtuous, vicious. Higher order evidence, I think, is a really interesting, important concept here to help us reflect on the notion of self-awareness. I think all this is relevant for personal decision making, to help for ourselves to make good decisions, but it's also central to being a socially responsible individual. And so the response to misinformation, what to do about misinformation was the question. Well, I think a response that maybe doesn't get enough attention and maybe needs more reflection and more development is that we have to cultivate self-awareness in ourselves and, I've already said that, learn to identify and admire it in others. Okay, well, 40 minutes. I nailed that. Thanks so much for listening, everybody, and I'm happy to take questions or hear your comments.
So I'll ask the first question, and then I'll give the microphone. David, one of the challenges is today, on both the right and the left, we've sort of moved in the direction of having talking heads, people who just seem to present themselves as an expert on any issue at all. Now, the same person can be an expert on vaccines, social justice, and other issues. How do we help people understand who they need to get out of the way of?
Right. Yeah, good question. So yeah, the talking heads are relying on lots of clicks. They're relying on a huge audience, and the way to do that is to be charismatic and to talk with confidence about whatever it is that you're talking about. And yeah, my own view on these individuals is that everybody needs to ask, why am I I mean, it's really your point. Why am I listening to this one individual or this small group of individuals for advice on such a wide range of subjects? What makes me think that that individual is the best informed for the kind of information that I need? So I think this is about trying to recognize self-awareness as a virtue in others, and when people are so patently lacking in self-awareness, then yeah, they're going to present themselves as experts even when they clearly are not.
I'm concerned about the epistemic atom. That is, you talked about epistemic socialism of a sort, and you didn't answer the question or point us in a direction of who's going to be the trusted epistemic atom who will start us on the right direction in that belief.
Right.
What are the standards that you would advocate for us making those judgments?
Right. Yes, that's a good question. And I think there is a lot of interesting work, there are a lot of interesting questions about how do you design a community in a way that's going to maximize their chances of providing providing the information that you need. So if you've got a community of individuals who is unwilling to listen to outside criticism, then that's a red flag that they're not doing it right. But I don't think there's going to be some individual. It's always going to start with conversation and dialogue. And what you want from that group is that they're striving to try and correct misconceptions, trying to correct errors, trying to find better ways of gathering reliable, relevant evidence. So you want a community who has the right kind of properties that are going to drive you forward. I think that's the answer.
So my question is about the self-awareness thing, and sort of projecting it as a virtue. My concern here is could that itself kind of present the same worrying individualism? Because as you mentioned, like evaluating our own biases is a very difficult thing to do, and just developing that virtue in people might be maybe too much to expect for them in the same way as the other things you mentioned.
Good. So two things. One, promoting self-awareness is offered as an alternative to what I think is the naive hope that we can all just overcome our biases through sheer force of will. So maybe in this particular case, I'm guilty of some wishful thinking. I know what I'll do. I'll just summon up some real good quality critical thinking and then overcome this tendency perhaps towards wishful thinking. So self-awareness is supposed to be recognition that, yeah, I can't just suppress biases and tendencies in this kind of way. Self-awareness is, yes, I am sort of flawed when it comes to evaluating certain kinds of evidence, and the higher order evidence can help me figure out where I'm more or less reliable. And then once I've got to that kind of something like humility, then I can start moving forward and figuring out what's the best way to proceed. And the best way to proceed is often going to be trying to identify those individuals or those groups who are better informed and better able to provide me with the kind of information or advice that I need. So, yeah, there was something else you said that I wanted to respond to.
Yeah, the question is like, does the self-awareness as this virtue that is expected to be developed in people, does that pursue the same?
Oh, right. Yeah, so the other thing I was going to say, that's right, thank you, that helped. We do all defer in lots and lots of cases to people who we recognize as being better positioned to understand the relevant evidence. So there's a sense in which we're already inclined to look to others and to recognize who the superiors are for relative to certain issues and follow their advice. So this is just, I think, a refinement of that skill. So it's not asking to do something that's completely unfamiliar. It's trying to get them to reflect on who are the right people to be listening to, given the goals that I have and the choices that I'm confronted with. Who should I be listening to and why? And that seems to me something a little different from just giving people more facts and figures, or just banging your fist on the table and saying, think better. That's the hope anyway.
Thank you. I was just wondering, where is the arbiter of truth, and who is the arbiter of truth? Could the experts ever have conflicts of interest? Could they ever be biased themselves?
Right.
Could the data be biased? Could what we're shown be biased?
Right.
Is there science that follows policy first in this collective mentality?
Right. Yeah, so I think it's a mistake to hope for a sort of absolute truth where there's no room for uncertainty. If that's the standard, then we're not going to reach it. But what we can still do is recognize the asymmetry between the individual who is pictured there on the left, who's trying to absorb the information, and the big crowd on the right. So the idea is that the crowd on the right will have their biases, that they will have ignored certain studies that should have been given more attention. There will be certain ideas that become popular because of something to do with the messenger rather than the quality of the evidence. So I'm certainly not suggesting that crowd over on the right is perfect in any sense. But all I think I really need in order to make an argument or make a case is convince you that a properly structured group on the right who has a genuine commitment to try and provide us with reliable information is a much better bet than the person on the left who's trying to do it all themselves. You're going to get more reliable information out of the crowd, even though it's still imperfect. Is that? And I wasn't sure about the policy following science question.
When there's a prevailing narrative and the policy is made, and then the science reflects that policy, or is allowed to reflect that policy.
Right.
Whatever is published in the major impact journals, that kind of thing.
Interesting. I think I'll just have to think more about that, and maybe if there's a particular example you have in mind, that we can talk about it afterwards. Thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned those examples of how dialoguing with people can help to alleviate some of the misinformation, and you were also talking about cultivating this virtue of self-awareness. But I would, like in the case with Mr. Black, for example, that's a very time-consuming process, and I would imagine that cultivating a virtue is also a time-consuming process. But my thought is that, like a lot of issues today that are relevant to the misinformation discussion, these are urgent issues that involve like questions of life and death, for example, that maybe that time needed isn't something that you can do. I'm just curious, like, what can you do in the face of those kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think when people are making potentially fatal decisions as a result of misinformation, there's probably not much you can do, unfortunately. So I think the short answer is all I have to offer is the sort of long game here. And yeah, it's unfortunate that there aren't quicker fixes. And if someone comes up with quicker fixes, then I'd be really happy. But yeah, I don't know what they are. Good point.
Not to be controversial, but sometimes public policy becomes a solution.
Okay.
You mandate an outcome.
Thank you so much. Really interesting stuff. So one way to dig into this is that this is a practical problem. What to do, right?
Right.
And so that people aren't afflicted by misinformation as often. And one of the long game things you suggested was being willing to engage in conversation or when you're afflicted by misinformation, or when somebody is afflicted by misinformation. So like you mentioned, we're all experts on some domain or another, and when we find ourselves in a situation where the topic that we're experts on, somebody is afflicted by misinformation, we should be willing to engage with them in conversation. And I was wondering about those conversations because I was wondering what is the ultimate purpose or goal that what are we trying to achieve when we engage in a conversation with somebody who's afflicted by misinformation? How do we conduct a conversation like that? Is the ultimate goal something other than just to provide them with lots more information? Because as you noted, that's not very effective. Is the ultimate goal to make ourselves seem trustworthy to such a person? Is that the ultimate goal? Because I think that might be better than just trying to correct them. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that was really helpful. Good. So one thing that perhaps I want to clarify when I talk about the importance of engaging with others, I don't mean to suggest that the only occasions when you should be engaging are when you are yourselves the expert. So it might be, for example, that I'm certainly not an expert on climate science, but I've spent long enough now over the last 15 years or so reading and trying to understand it for teaching purposes that I think I know more than most people about it. So it might be that I'm, in some instances, the right person to correct some misconceptions about climate change. In part because I know a little bit more than perhaps the people I'm talking to, even though I'm not an expert. But also, and this speaks to the second half of your question, it might be that I'm the right person to speak to them because they trust me to some extent, and they're more likely to listen to me than they're likely to read the relevant articles or the relevant media posts. So yeah, I think when you enter into those conversations, one thing to consider is don't expect some grand conversion on the part of whoever you're talking to. That's setting the standards too high. But if we can think about it in terms of just putting pressure in the right ways, then that might be useful. So if we're trying to nudge people in the right kind of direction, that might be as much as we can do. But we're trying to do something is better than nothing. And on the trust issue, I think that's exactly right. That if we think about those communities, then I talked about it mainly in terms of knowledge being unevenly distributed across the community. But you're absolutely right that within any large community, there are going to be all kinds of differing social relations. Some people trust some individuals more than others. And if you happen to be a person who's trusted and you have information that might help other people, then yeah, I think you're the right person to try and start conversations. There's an interesting literature on how to get people out of cults, and the overwhelming conclusion from this work is people exit cults only when they've formed a trusting relationship with somebody outside the cult. Until that happens, then there's almost no hope for them from getting out. So yeah, relationships of trust, I think, play a really important role in this story.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
I'll go. as long as you want.
Oh, no, never say that to this group. Yeah, we'll get you out and then you guys over there.
I'm curious, have you had any studies or any thoughts on these improvements we're making in like artificial intelligence and how we can put on a pair of Google glasses and have an IQ of over 10,000 almost instantaneously, and how this information can then be used for either enhancing or taking away misinformation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's nice to be asked something about AI with a kind of positive spin to it rather than a lot of the fear-mongering, it seems. So I haven't thought about it. I'm aware that studies on the efficacy of fact-checking are not very promising. That seems sort of related. It also seems like it might relate a little back to what we were just saying about trust, that some of these new AI check machines are talking, well, in terrifying ways in some cases, but they're also talking in a way that might actually generate some trust between the user and the platform. And so potentially, yeah, I suppose there's a room there for some kind of solution. Of course, then the fear is, yeah, who's programming the AI, and what are its sources, and is it who's making sure that it's tapping into the right kinds of studies? But yeah, really interesting question. I haven't really thought about it a lot, so thank you.
So I have a couple comments to make first off. I don't believe in mandates, number one, because this is America, it's still freedom, right? So you have a choice. Number two, I went to ETSU and saw What is a Woman, and there was a group of individuals there that were against it. So you're saying people need to be informed on both sides. So these students all turned their backs while the movie played. So my question to you is, there's a challenge there. How do you get the younger generation to wake up and realize, okay, this is What is a Woman? You want to be informed on both sides, but you're turning your back and looking at your iPhones. You're not listening to the other side. And as for higher order evidence, it's like there's intuition, there's your gut, and it's like common sense. People need to be using all those things, because higher order evidence to me sounds very socialistic. And it's like, you can laugh, but that's where we're going, right? And so we're only going to be listening to the people that of academia, and it'll be one-sided. I don't agree with that. I think there are a lot of intelligent people out there that can make up their own minds, make their own decisions, and they're well thought, and they have to do what's best for them. You know, so my question to you is, what do you do with young people that are only looking at one side? What do you do with other people, or even higher order evidence where you're only seeing the evidence of one side? That's a huge problem right now in this country.
Okay, so thanks for the questions. So higher order evidence shouldn't be one-sided. So one thing I should have emphasized more is that when I talk about experts, I don't mean just the people in ivory towers, the people in labs and academics and so on. Everybody is expert on all kinds of things that are hugely relevant when it comes to trying to figure out social problems and trying to figure out what we value and why we value it and what are the best means for trying to achieve our goals. So yeah, higher order evidence is just evidence about your own abilities. So it doesn't tap into anything. So it shouldn't conjure up ideas of a sort of elitism. Now, some of the comments you made there were about you know, there are a lot of smart people out there who are quite capable of making up their own minds. Certainly, there are lots of smart people out there who are aware of their goals and can try and figure out the best way of achieving those goals. The worry is that sometimes they're going to be distracted by the slick advertising campaign or the propaganda. And it's enormously difficult to try and cut through that and try and figure out who's best informed to help me make a reliable decision. And then, yeah, how do you get people to listen to both sides? You'd think I would have something to say about that. I mean, I think it starts with finding commonality. What is it we're trying to achieve here? Why are you wanting to show this film? Why are you not wanting to watch this film? A lot of these conversations end up being about rights. And, well, we have a right to do it, and we have a right to do that, and that doesn't seem to me like it's going to be very, very productive. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's the Derek Black kind of case that you just have to be on the lookout for opportunities to talk to people who are on the other side, and then don't shy away from them because it's potentially going to be uncomfortable for you or upsetting. And again, that doesn't mean go around trying to correct everybody on everything, but you have to be selective just for the sake of your own mental health, I think. But, yeah.
I'd just add what you said before, which is if people start recognizing their own biases, they'll be more open to seeing both sides. Because if you understand, if I understand that I start with a particular point of view, I can't make a reasonable decision if I don't accept that.
The bullet point, excuse me, the bullet point there at the top of the screen says misinformation undermines good decision making. Now, with regards to the internet and everything, we can go home and sit on our couch and gather information that's maybe good, maybe bad. I think it's a huge, huge deterrent to good decision making and ethical decision making. You know, now you all know, I'm sure, there are algorithms out there that will you start asking questions. If the wrong person is attempting you to answer, it's going to forward you material that only supports a particular point of view. I think that's a huge problem that we just don't have a handle on these days. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have anything to add. Okay.